Now we talk about the highly anticipated R. Kelly case. We're getting close to a verdict and finding out if he'll be convicted on sex trafficking and racketeering charges. The singer's defense team is close to wrapping up its case, which means the jury could begin deliberating by Friday. R. Kelly is on trial in New York, and you know that because BNC Live has been covering it from gavel to gavel. We'll continue to do that. William Wagstaff, he is a civil rights attorney. He joins us now for more analysis, joining us from New York, to be in fact. All right, Attorney Wagstaff, we have a list of charges against R. Kelly, from racketeering, kidnapping, sexual exploitation of a child, forced labor, bribery, Mann Act. I'm running out of fingers. Talk about how serious these charges are, and if you think the prosecutors presented enough evidence to get a conviction.
I think that we all can understand that any crime that is accusing a person of being involved with underage people is always going to rise to a high level of seriousness. Certainly the Mann Act, which is going to make it illegal to transport across state lines any person for the purpose of immoral activity, is extremely serious. So I think that without knowing what the sentencing guidelines are, because there are certain factors that come into the range that he can be actually convicted and sentenced to, it's safe to say that if convicted, Mr. Kelly is going to spend a long time in jail.
What has stood out to you in this case?
What stood out to me is the amount of people that he was able to keep engaged and under his control for presumably multiple decades. Normally, regardless of someone's celebrity, if these allegations were 20 to 30% true, there would have been someone along the course of these years that would have blown the whistle. So to think that it took the Me Too movement and sort of America's awakening to deal with the way that men have traditionally mistreated women, specifically in entertainment, and men that have had power, before he was going to be called to task is a little bit surprising to me.
Okay, so let's go back to his defense now. The defense presentation, it seems that it's much shorter than what prosecutors laid out in the trial. Why do you think that was? And talk about the implications it could have on the outcome of the trial, if any.
Well, what's always good to remember is that in theory, there didn't need to be a defense. You are not, as the defendant, required to present any evidence. The prosecution has the burden. So in theory, all his attorneys needed to do, if anything, was cross-examine the prosecution's witnesses and say that they were going to let the case go to the jury. So it's important not to get caught up on the quantity of evidence and look more to the quality of evidence. They did weeks and weeks of witnesses, and it'll probably be 2 days at best of defense witnesses, but that doesn't in one way or the other mean that he's innocent. It doesn't in the other direction mean that he's guilty. Really what the defense's job is to point to reasonable doubt. As long as they can do that, if they can do that with one witness or if they need 100 witnesses, that's essentially what the goal is of Mr. Kelly's defense.
All right, so the defense, and I'm going to paraphrase here, called some of the accusers disgruntled groupies. How credible were these witnesses and accusers?
I think that the witnesses were very credible, but I also think you look at the situation that he is in, they were not going to give him any leniency. So he had no choice, in my opinion, but to roll the dice, take it to trial, and try to defend himself, because he still has charges in other jurisdictions. There is no real pathway that he was going to be able to plea his way out of this circumstance. So even though the witnesses were absolutely credible, he had nothing else. I don't believe that there was another theory of the case that the defense could have used, but saying that they were disgruntled groupies. There was so much evidence against him.
Well, what makes this case any different than the previous one where he got off?
I think, again, to my earlier point, at the time that he was charged with the child pornography, he had much more control over the witnesses. He had control over the circumstances, where now it seems that the victims have been emboldened, and the people that were previously his allies have either had a crisis of conscience or just realized that what they were doing was no longer sustainable, And now that there was just too much for him to cover up in this case versus the previous case.
Attorney Wagstaff, I got to go, but how much time is R. Kelly looking at?
I think that he's going to spend no less than 10 to 15 years in jail if convicted of all of these charges.
And that's just on this case. That has nothing to do with the other cases in other states as well.
Correct.
All right, Attorney Wagstaff, live from New York with us today, talking about R. Kelly's trial. Thank you, sir, for joining us.